Not in the mood to talk here. I don't understand.
Men, we can't live without them, yet still can't live with them.
Men, why we hate them.
We need to talk now, he said, turning to face Dad. In private, he added, giving Tenny a dirty look. Please excuse us, Dad said to Tenny, heaving a huge sigh. I'm sure he could already tell it would be a long night. Tenny stood there like she hadn't heard what Dad had said. She looked like she was still contemplating whether to leave. Leave this room now, Steve screamed in anger, frightening even me. You could tell he was trying hard to stop himself from harming Tenny, who immediately ran out afterward. I'm sure even she could tell that staying longer could put her life at risk. Stephen and Dad went into the inner room to have a tete-a-tete after she left, leaving a confused mom and me behind. It didn't seem to have gone so well because Dad stormed out of the inner room after about 30 minutes of arguing, only to drive off again with Tenny. What's the matter, Stephen? Please explain to me what's going on, Mom begged when Stephen joined us. Why did Dad rush out like that? I added, still very concerned about the madness that had been going on for the past hour. I think I'm going to have to get you that apartment you asked for, he said, turning to face Mom. You might have to stay at my place for a few days before then, he added. You still haven't answered the question, I probed further. What happened between you and Dad? Mom, pack your bags, he continued, ignoring my question and walking towards the door. I'll be back to pick you up tomorrow evening. I'm still waiting for my answer, I shouted, rushing to stop him from leaving. I'm not in the mood to talk right now, he said, shaking his head frantically as he walked out.
Not in the mood to talk here. I don't understand. So you're just going to leave me hanging without explaining the madness that just went on here. Let's see how Sonia is going to handle this.
Dad didn't come back home that night. I couldn't wait till the next day for any explanations because having to wait would give me sleepless nights. So I called Stephen before going to bed. I figured by then he would have been calm enough to answer my questions. And I was right. Tenny and Stephen had a short fling that I never knew about sometime in the past. As I mentioned earlier, Stephen was the kind of man who had very little time for women. He was all about his business and considered women to be distractions. Occasionally, when he wasn't too caught up with work, he had only enough time for flings with any lady considered attractive at that time. It was during one of his less busy periods that he met Tenny. Being the blunt man that he was, he had warned her from the start that their relationship would be mainly for sexual pleasure, as he wasn't ready for any commitment. She willingly agreed, probably thinking that she would never fall for him, or he would change his mind. Unfortunately for her, she started falling for him almost immediately. She eventually let her feelings get the best of her and started getting jealous when she saw him speaking to other women, even if he was just asking for the time. Eventually, Stephen noticed and didn't waste time cutting off all ties with her. The fling ended up lasting barely a month, even though Tenny refused to acknowledge that it was over. She tried everything she could to make Stephen fall in love with her, including faking a pregnancy, but it never worked. She was heartbroken and vowed to pay Stephen back for breaking her heart. I suspect Dad must have been part of the payback, but what baffles me is how she was able to find out who Dad was and find her way into his pants. It suddenly dawned on me that she had pretended to be shocked when I ran into her and Dad at the restaurant while knowing what she was doing. I decided that I would leave the house too if Mom did. I couldn't stand suffering the torture of being alone in the same place as Dad and Tenny. I packed my bags, ready to follow. I didn't care if the house would be crowded or we would be at risk of infections like meningitis, which usually spreads in crowded living conditions. I knew I wasn't staying back in my father's house, and moving in with Nonso was out of the question. I must admit that I exaggerated when I mentioned we were at risk of getting meningitis. I was trying to prove a point. The truth is, meningitis is usually spread in more crowded living conditions like dormitories or situations where too many people are sharing a room with poor ventilation. It's an infection of the membranes protecting the brain and spinal cord, and it's caused by viruses, bacteria, and in rare cases, fungi. It can spread by coughing, sneezing, kissing, sharing cutlery, and sharing toothbrushes. It may be life-threatening sometimes. That's why it is vital to ensure all family members, including yourself and your children, are vaccinated against the infection. I guess the doctor in me wouldn't be satisfied if I mentioned a medical condition without explaining it. That's probably why I always go out of my way to explain every medical condition that comes up. Nevertheless, movie production and directing will always be my first love. The next day dragged very slowly. I was very touchy and kept snapping at everyone around me. I was frustrated at how my family was slowly becoming a mess, with my dad acting very irrational, Mom and I having to move out, and Steve vowing never to speak to Dad again. I just wished everything could go back to how it was when Dad had little money. At least we were happy then. During lunchtime, I thought about Nonso and how talking to him would have made me feel better. He hadn't tried calling me since we parted ways on the plane, and I hadn't called him either. After much contemplation, I decided to swallow my pride and give him a call. I was about to pick up my phone when it rang. I looked at the screen. It was Nonso calling. I was too shocked to even react. Nonso had never been one to apologize, especially when he didn't think he was at fault. And even when he was, he'd do everything to make up for his mistakes rather than apologize. So I didn't understand why he was calling. Hello, I said, picking up the phone. Sonia, I'm sorry for how I acted towards you, he began. Nonso apologizing. I must be hearing things, I thought to myself. I need your help now. He sounded desperate. I realized he was calling because he needed my help. I should have known better than to think otherwise. What do you need my help for? I'm calling from the police station, he replied. Police station? I gasped. What on earth are you doing there? I was arrested last night. Arrested? I repeated, very puzzled. For doing what? He was about to say something, then paused for a while. I can't explain over the phone. I need you to come as soon as possible, he begged. After hanging up the phone, I was as confused as ever. Worries over Nonso had replaced all the previous worries about my family in my mind. What could he possibly have done to get himself into trouble? And why was he reluctant to say it over the phone? I couldn't come up with any explanation that made sense. I slammed the phone on my desk, closing my eyes and taking a deep breath. It appeared everything that could possibly go wrong did, all in 1 week.
What has Nonso gotten himself into again? Every time he's like this guy, from one problem to another, from one drama to the other. Now he's calling Sonia that he has been arrested. What is she supposed to do about it? Is she a lawyer or what exactly is she supposed to do? What do you think is going on? What do you think? Did he commit a crime? Let's know what you think in the comment section while we wait for the next episode. If you're enjoying the story so far and you really don't want to have to wait till the next episode, then there's good news for you. The book is actually available in paperback and ebook format
on Amazon and Seller.
So you just need to go to Amazon and type in Men Why We Hate Them by Olufemi Idowu, and it will bring up the book, and you get to choose whether you want the ebook, paperback, or the audiobook.
For users that don't have access to Amazon, you can download the ebook on seller.co.
And you get to read these and many more exciting titles from yours truly. Men, Why We Hate Them.